Hello, and welcome to the CannAtlantic Conference, the country's first Mid-Atlantic Cannabis Conference brought to you by the Philadelphia Association of Black Journalists. If you're watching this presentation is the State of the State Cannabis Report in Washington, D.C. Leading us through this presentation is Tyler McFadden, the co-founder of North Star Liberty Group. Thank you so much for joining, Tyler. I really appreciate you coming on and letting people know about what's happening in D.C.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to talk about this. It's an interesting subject.
And you go on when you're ready.
Like Dahid said, my name is Tyler McFadden. I'm co-founder and principal at North Star Liberty Group. We're a government relations and consulting firm that specializes in cannabis. We do everything from lobbying at all levels of government. We've helped out with applications in different states across the U.S. About Washington, D.C. I'll discuss the actual city, what's going on in the city of D.C., as well as the federal government. I just want to point out real quick, when I move on to my next slide, you can see at the bottom, taxation without representation. I want to point out that the states that you guys are going to be hearing about today, that you've already been hearing about earlier today, they're all states. All these states that we're talking about in the Mid-Atlantic region, they have their markets because they were allowed to do so based on the fact that they are self-governing states. DC is still not a state. DC is fighting to become a state. And at the bottom of every license plate in the city, taxation without representation is there because we do pay taxes. We do basically everything. We're Americans, but we do not have the same rights as every other state in this country. So a bit local history of DC. It was established by the Residence Act in 1790. It made DC the permanent capital of the United States. New York was first, and then Philadelphia, and then DC. And it remains to this day the seat of the federal government. People were allowed to vote early on, but it was a very small city, a federal enclave. And it kind of got to the point where people, especially post the Civil War, you'll see 1870s, it became a hub for freed Black folks, freed former slaves. We were able to self-govern, but the powers that be decided to strip DC, to strip residents of DC of their local representation largely because we were a very heavily Black populated city. So it was done to disenfranchise those Black folks, Black male voters specifically, because obviously women were not allowed to vote in the 1870s. So fast forward a little bit before the Civil Rights Movement, or I guess at the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement, DC became the nation's first predominantly Black city. It's where it got its nickname, Chocolate City. That population reached its peak at 71% in 1970. Now it's about 45%. We have had a lot of immigration into this city. A lot of people who are not from DC, myself included. I'm from St. Louis, Missouri. A lot of people from different parts of the country and different parts of the world coming to DC. So it's not just gentrification that's making the city not so Black, but there's positives and negatives that come from having a more diverse city. We're still Chocolate City though. Go-Go is still a big deal, as is Mumbo Sauce. And then in 1961, the 23rd Amendment allowed us to vote for president and vice president for the first time in over 100 years. And then 10 years later, we were able to then have somebody represent us in government and the federal government. However, that person is non-voting. So they're a delegate, very similar to how the U.S. Virgin Islands has a delegate, similar to how Puerto Rico has a delegate. We do not have an ability. Eleanor Holmes Norton, who is our representative, she does not have the ability to vote. She can speak on the House floor. She can talk about bills. She can introduce bills, but she cannot vote. We also do not have 2 voting senators. So we only have 1 non-voting representative in DC with a population of over 700,000 people, which is more than Vermont and Wyoming. So then a few years later, Home Rule Act was passed, which finally allowed us to have local leadership. So we were able to start electing mayors and the city council, which kind of now function as, state and local government at the same time. So leading into history of cannabis reform in the city, we legalized medical marijuana in 2010. The D.C. Council did that. And Congress, the way that we pass laws here in the city is that Congress has to say no to things if they don't want us to do it. So they could have said, no, we don't want you to have a medical marijuana program, and we wouldn't have been able to have one. So Congress is allowed to overrule something within a set amount of time that the city passes. Medical marijuana is something that, because the city council passed it, they had to pass it on to Congress. And Congress doesn't have to say yes, they just have to let it go past the deadline, and then it becomes law in the city. So it took a few years for the medical marijuana program to start making sales. However, the medical marijuana program now is fairly robust. I'm going to get into that in a little bit. In 2014, DC voters passed legalization. We passed Initiative 71 by a large margin in November 2014. It became law in February 2015. Now, this is legalization similar to how Vermont has it-ish, just because Vermont doesn't yet have an operating market. DC, because we couldn't pass a market because that would take legislation that Congress would then say no to, we had to pass something that basically allows for the possession and cultivation of cannabis for adults, and for private use. So we do not have a market because Congress basically says we can't. And I'm going to get into a conversation about that in a little bit. And then 2020, DC fights for statehood. So for the first time ever, you guys might have heard about this, HR 51, which was introduced by Eleanor Holmes Norton, who is our U.S. representative. I call her representative, even though she's technically a delegate. She introduced HR 51, and it passed the House floor earlier this year. This bill would make DC a state. It would make DC the 51st state. Ironically, Holmes Norton introduced it. She couldn't vote yes on it. So, that's a conundrum in and of itself. So DC, the House voted to support DC statehood for the very first time. And now it's moved on to the Senate. So our medical market, like I said before, it's gotten rather robust. And it's a market that's very similar, in terms of levity, or not necessarily levity, but the ability to be kind of, casting a wide net and not making it too cumbersome to get involved with and as a patient. So possession, a patient may possess up to 2 ounces at any one time. They're allowed to cultivate. This is not restricted to medical patients, by the way. It's not just medical patients who can cultivate. Any adult over the age of 21 can cultivate cannabis. That was passed under Initiative 71 in 2014. And I'll discuss the specifics of cultivation in just a slide or two. And then reciprocity. This is something that you're seeing more and more states do, which is it allows for a person who's a patient, registered patient in a state with an equivalent medical marijuana market program. That might be in DC, they might be a college student, they might be visiting. They're allowed to go into a medical marijuana dispensary here in the city and purchase cannabis. As long as they are from a state that has an equivalent market. So somebody from Massachusetts, somebody from Illinois, a state that has a relatively loose market. Georgia, for instance, we do not allow Georgia patients to come in and purchase cannabis because flower is not legal in Georgia. There's a THC cap on the Georgia market. So, it has to be an equivalent state. It's 20 some states that DC recognizes as equivalent. So DC, when I talk about it being loose, it's because our qualifying conditions list, well, we don't really have a list. It's any condition for which treatment with medical marijuana would be beneficial. When a physician says it would be beneficial. So a lot of states have a list. That list can be long or short. Ones that are common are, glaucoma or sometimes anxiety disorders or some eating disorders, things like that. But DC allows for any condition that a physician says a person might be helped if they could access medical cannabis. So cultivation, as I mentioned before, it's not just restricted to medical patients. Anybody can cultivate. There's no There's no registry. You don't have to say that you're growing cannabis on your private property. You can just do it. An adult is allowed to have up to 6 plants at a time, 12 plants in a household. So if you have 2 adults in a DC household, you're allowed to have 12 plants in that household cap. Half of those plants can be flowering or mature at any one time. So if you have 12 plants, you can only have 6 flowering plants at one time in a household. So as of June 18th, 2020, there were a little over 7,000 patients in the medical marijuana program in Washington, D.C. And there is a purchase limit of 4 ounces per 30-day period. So you're allowed to have 2 ounces on your person at any one time, but you are allowed to purchase up to 4 ounces any 30-day period. So the adult use market, this is where it gets weird because we are, like I said, not a state. And because DC overwhelmingly supports legalization, we, want to see the market thriving. And so now we have the illicit market. It is thriving. This weird gray area that the adult use market is in means that there's a lack of regulation, and it means that, safety could be a concern. Not safety and violent crime or anything like that. More like making sure that you're getting what you are supposed to be getting, when you purchase cannabis off somebody who might be operating in the illicit market. So with this gray area, it is legal to possess up to 2 ounces at a time, same as a medical patient. Cultivation, again, not limited to medical patients. So you are allowed to have up to 12 plants per household as long as you have more than 1 adult in that household. Public consumption is a misdemeanor, which is punishable with a citation, no fine. The problem with that is that it's not necessarily enforced in that manner. It's enforced. It's over-enforced. It's over-policed in specific communities. DC, just because we're Chocolate City, does not make us immune to the racial issues for cannabis enforcement, even though we are existing in this weird gray market where people are legally allowed to possess cannabis. And then personal transfer. This is the weird part of our market because it has allowed small businesses to grow in this weird gray space. And there, I had a friend of mine who works for a council member, likes to say that this is illegal to do. So by no means am I telling people that this is legal. It's just weird. So you are allowed to, first of all, if you're growing cannabis, you're allowed to transfer to your friend up to 1 ounce of cannabis for no money. You cannot receive money. Which is normal. I mean, gifting cannabis is one thing from person to person, myself and my friend, right? But this is where it gets weird, is that businesses have started to pop up where you purchase a juice for $50. And then when they deliver that juice to you, they give you a gift of 1/8 of cannabis or whatever their offerings are. And it's gotten so far as that you can choose your strain, or, they'll tell you what strain they have that day. So again, not legal, but it's like this weird gray area. It's a massive loophole that they've not really managed to close. And so we see a lot of pop-ups that exist for a few months at a time, and then they get raided and shut down, and then more pop-ups pop up. And, we have cannabis-related events that are definitely illegal, but I mean, this is where people are getting their cannabis from. If not, from their neighborhood person, they're going to these pop-ups. So it's just a weird gray market. And DC wants to legalize. We want to have a legal regulated market. But congressional interference keeps us from doing so. So because our market is in this weird gray area, and by no means am I saying that full regulated legalization will remedy this, because we've seen in states across the country that that's not the case. There's still a problem. But nationally, I'm sure you guys have heard this 1.5 million times. Nationally, Black folks are about 4 times more likely to be arrested for cannabis-related offenses than whites, despite identical rates of use. And in DC, between 2012 and 2019, almost 90% of those arrested on cannabis charges were Black. And like I said, DC is about 45% Black now. And it is, as somebody who's been in DC since 2010, I went to George Washington University, 3% Black. I mean, I can't tell you how many white kids I've seen illegally smoking marijuana before it was legal here in DC. But I can tell you all the people I know who got arrested for cannabis or in trouble for cannabis in some form, whether it was at my school or in my neighborhoods after I graduated, were Black. And so again, a legal market will not remedy this. It won't fix it because the criminal justice system is inherently racist. But a legal market will help. Will it fix it? Absolutely not. There are whole lots of discussions that need to be had about what we really can do. So there's discussions about DC shouldn't be a state because we don't have the same responsibilities as every other citizen of this country or any other person that lives in the United States. That is simply not true. In 2014, we paid the federal government $26.4 billion in federal income taxes. That is the highest per capita rate of any state in the United States. So we pay a lot, an exorbitant amount, but we don't get the same. We don't get the same resources that other states do for things like COVID-19 state money, like from the feds. We got like a third of what other states got. Even though we have, again, more people than Wyoming and Vermont, we pay a whole lot of money, in federal income taxes, and we're still not getting what we're due. That includes we're not able to control what we do with our own money. So I just wanted to put this out here just to show you, like, this is an issue. It extends far past cannabis. So statehood. Statehood would fix the cannabis market issue here in the city because Congress is allowed to do something as brazen as what Andy Harris has been doing for the last 5 years. Well, not technically 5 years. Andy Harris is the only Republican congressman from the Maryland delegation. He is a doctor. He's from Maryland, District 1. So further down south, I believe on the eastern shore of Maryland. And he has been putting a rider into the appropriations budget every year since we passed legalization here to say that we cannot use any money to legalize or to create a legal cannabis market here in the city. They've kept that in the budget language every year since then. 2019 was the first year where he withdrew that language. However, the Senate did add it in, and then Democrats in the House didn't put up a fight. So, if the Harris rider had been lifted, if the Senate hadn't have included it, or if the House Democrats had fought to keep it, then we would likely have a legal cannabis market in the works right now because the council's ready. The council's ready, and I'm going to talk about that in just a second. So what now? Active efforts and policy. I'm going to talk a little bit about what's happening at the DC level and then at the federal level. Local legislation, I'm going to talk about 2 legalization bills, one of which Mayor Bowser has proposed, and then one was introduced by Councilman David Grasso, who's been the leader on cannabis-related issues since he's been on the council. I can't remember how long he's been on the council, but he's been the voice for cannabis in the council. And then one more bill, Prohibition of marijuana testing, which would ban pre-employment testing as a condition of employment. Excuse me. So the Safe Cannabis Act, again, that is Mayor Bowser's bill. It has individual limits, purchase limits, specific to the product. 1 ounce of flour, 5 grams concentrate, 16 ounces of edibles, and 27 ounces of liquids. Those are the individual daily purchase rates. It upholds the restrictions on public consumption, so does not include anything like cannabis cafes or anything like that. It does have a 17% tax rate. It allows online shopping and delivery services. Delivery services is another thing that has really been booming. All these micro businesses. So there's a conversation really about how do we really prioritize small businesses when we talk about DC. She made sure to include that individuals with prior misdemeanors are allowed to work at facilities. Things like, having a local level misdemeanor. That does not include federal charges. That is something that I don't believe the city has the jurisdiction to, talk about or to put into legislation like this. It also automates record sealing. DC is kind of odd. You hear about expungements a lot, but DC, the legal structure is largely on record sealing rather than expungements. And then it reinvests tax revenue to impacted communities in DC. So on the business side of this, medical marijuana retailers will have first dibs for the first 6 months after enactment. So basically, it would allow for retail sales to get started as soon as possible after legislation is passed to create a legal marijuana market, because Initiative 71, again, does not have a market scheme in it. So we would have to do it legislatively, which is what a lot of states, New Jersey is one state where if they pass this ballot measure in November, they're going to have to go back to the state legislature next year and put together a regulatory structure. So, that's a positive and negative. Positive because, we can start legal sales ASAP. Negative is that it, does not do a whole lot to help small businesses and businesses that would want to get in. DC has a diverse, DC is very small in terms of mileage. A lot of owners in DC that are cannabis related business owners are Black. So that's a positive. However, there is not a whole lot of socioeconomic diversity in the industry, which is, an issue when we have something like this vertical integration where you allow for medical dispensaries to start with retail sales. It includes licenses, cultivators, manufacturers, distributors, all of those things, general ones. 60% of ownership and employees of all new licensees must be DC residents. This is important. Mayor Bowser wants to make sure that we're keeping money in the city. And DC has special business write-offs for businesses that are based in DC that have more than 50% ownership of people based in DC. So this is very similar to what already exists in business regulations here in the city. And then it would just rename the Regulation Administration to include cannabis. All right, the Marijuana Legalization and Regulation Act. This would basically regulate cannabis closely to the way it regulates alcohol. It includes proactive expungement of marijuana-related crimes from a person's record, so somebody doesn't have to go to the court, someone doesn't have to spend money and take on that extra burden to get their records sealed or expunged. So that is a big deal, and it's something that a lot of criminal justice circles are trying to figure out how to do on a larger scale to make sure that states can take on that burden instead of the person who's carried that burden of a cannabis-related record, that they shouldn't be burdened even more to get that removed. And then it establishes a dedicated marijuana fund, which includes all sales and excise tax revenue from adult use sales. And to be very clear, all sales tax revenue, not all sales, just to be super clear. And David Grasso also, the difference between the two legalization bills are not super large, but David Grasso is, a progressive champion. So most of his bills, especially in comparison to our mayor, are a lot more progressive or a lot more further looking, I guess is the best way to say it. So, as far as structure, not super different, but there's more criminal justice aspects to the MLRA than there are to the Safe Cannabis Act. Then the prohibition of marijuana testing. It would prohibit testing as a condition of employment unless required by law. So there's a large swath of people that this does not include. Like if you are a teacher or if you're somebody who needs a CDL license to drive trucks, if you are a police officer, you are exempt from these protections. You don't have these protections. But anybody else, somebody who might be in the service industry or somebody who might, be in a private industry that does not have a safety hazard involved, they are protected. So you are not allowed to be tested for cannabis as a condition of employment. And another piece of legislation, emergency legislation that was signed into law recently, protects medical marijuana patients under the same list. There's an argument basically about the large swath of people that does not cover. There's a conversation about, the ability to really test somebody's inebriation, right? If you're a medical marijuana patient and you've been smoking cannabis for 10 years every single day, your level of inebriation is not going to be the same as somebody who smokes cannabis for fun and once a month. Not advocating for anybody to operate heavy machinery or anything like that. But, the way we talk about cannabis and inebriation and being high, we don't have conversations about what being tired looks like when you're on the job, or what being hungover looks like when you're on the job, or if you haven't had your coffee that day. So there's a whole conversation about that, which is why this bill in particular we're kind of split on the advocacy side about, because it's good. It's a step forward. However, it doesn't do enough, according to some people, to protect those who, might want to go home and consume some cannabis after their workday is over. So federal, talk a little bit about HR 51, as I've mentioned before, and then the MORE Act, which is the most important on this list, in my opinion, and then the Safe Banking Act, which I'm sure you guys have heard of already. It's been in the news for forever. Washington, D.C. Admission Act. Like I said before, we can't do what we want to do, and we want to be a state so that we can do what we want to do in cannabis and otherwise. So it would admit us into the U.S. as the 51st state. We would no longer be the District of Columbia. We would be the Douglas Commonwealth, named after Frederick Douglass, who's very famous Washington, D.C. Not native. I don't believe he was enslaved in D.C. I can't remember where he was enslaved, but he has a house still standing here in the city. So very, very famous, influential Black man from the city. It gives all of us here, 700,000 DC residents, equal representation in Congress, including 2 senators, and Eleanor Holmes Norton would finally be able to vote. And whoever, comes after her, anybody who is elected from the District of Columbia to the Douglas Commonwealth, federal congressional delegation would have a vote. It would also allow us to use our own money without congressional oversight, which would then allow for us to pass a legal marijuana market. The MORE Act, most comprehensive federal marijuana federal marijuana reform bill ever introduced in U.S. Congress. Now, to be clear, it is not a legalization bill. Federal legalization is not possible. It lifts federal prohibition. It's a federal decriminalization bill because it would remove cannabis from the Controlled Substances Act. It also includes a tax regime that pays for expungements in small business growth. So it would do that in a way that the states would be able to directly benefit. So it's kind of a carrot approach to do this, expand your marijuana reform or expand your marijuana markets in medical or adult use, and you will be able to benefit from the federal government to make sure that you can expunge records and you can grow small businesses in your state or in your district. It mandates immigration protections. So right now, you can be denied citizenship, you can be denied permanent residency, you can be denied entry if you admit to consuming cannabis ever. You don't have to have a crime on your record. You don't have to be caught with anything. If you admit that you had consumed cannabis, even if you're living in somewhere like Colorado, where it's legal, the federal government can say that your morality is not up to snuff, that you are not of the right moral standard of an American citizen or someone who should be allowed to live in this country. So the MORE Act would help that because, we already have enough barriers to immigration. We don't need more, especially something based in something ridiculous as that. And it creates the Cannabis Justice Office and the DOJ just to make sure that the law is being followed. The SBA provisions in the MORE Act are really important, Small Business Administration provisions. Right now, most cannabis businesses are funded by someone's personal wealth or by their network. And we know who has personal wealth and a wealthy network in this country, and it's not people who look like me. And that's just from centuries of systemic oppression, economic oppression, segregation. So opening up the SBA, opening up bank loans to folks who want to get involved in the industry is really, really important. And that's why the SBA provisions in the MORE Act are important, because small business growth is a bipartisan issue. Cannabis is really a bipartisan issue at this point. 51 to 53% of Republicans agree that it should be federally legal. But small business is something that everybody can agree on. And the SBA provisions are really important to making that happen. And then it also undercuts the illicit market because there's local accessibility. to regulated high quality products. When you have a federal law that says you are allowed to do what you want with your cannabis market, we can't tell you not to do it, unless it's not a good idea, unless it's something that's illegal or something that could harm people, obviously. But having that local ownership, as is the last bullet point says, making sure that we're keeping money in the communities, we're giving people a way to capitalize on an industry that they might have been participating in illicitly for years and is an expert. Giving people a way to go straight, to do it legally and in a regulated market, to make sure that we're keeping the money in our communities. And then the Safe Banking Act, kind of similar to the Sba Provisions, but it's, really kind of, it's not as focused on small business. It's something that the industry loves. Sorry to any industry folks listening, industry has been painfully quiet on things that are focused on social justice, but they love to talk about the Safe Banking Act. So passing the Safe Banking Act would be good. It passed the House. So the Senate, Mitch McConnell has it stacked in the large stack of things he still hasn't considered yet. But right now, myself included, cannabis-related businesses could have their bank accounts closed without warning at any time. My business, government relations business, we don't touch plants ever, not professionally. And we, we're not, what we do is legal in every sense of the word, in any state, in every locality, anywhere you are in the United States, what we do is legal. We just talk to people, right? But we could have our bank account closed because we say cannabis on our website. It's a possibility. It's not just plant touching companies that are at risk here. Larger companies, the Acreage and all those, the True Leaves and all those people, they're not really at risk because they bring in millions and millions of dollars. Banks don't want to lose out on that money. But it's really the small businesses that suffer the most. Because again, as I mentioned before, most cannabis businesses are started with personal wealth. And when you're not allowed to go into a bank to get a loan, that cuts off a lot of potential business owners. And it keeps people that aren't, independently wealthy from getting started in the cannabis industry or continuing their current cannabis business in a regulated manner. So again, even ancillary businesses like mine, custodial services, janitorial services, security services that specialize in cannabis, like dispensaries or cultivation centers, they could get their bank accounts closed just because they are in proximity to the cannabis industry. So action steps, what you can do to help. What you can do to help DC finally have a legal market, and what you can do to help the federal government finally pass common sense reform. First, tell your senators to support DC statehood. Excuse me, the House already passed HR 51, as I mentioned. Bill has moved to the Senate for consideration. DC Vote is a great organization that's been working on this for a long, long time, and they are the experts. So I would really encourage you, if this is something that you want to get involved in, or at least just send letters to your senators or call your senators' offices. Sign up for their listserv, consider donating, helping to uplift their mission, because they are doing some great work and it's really, really important. Secondly, MORE Act. It was supposed to be brought to the floor earlier this week, but Republicans were able to, not all Republicans, there are co-sponsors, Republican co-sponsors, there are Republican supporters of the MORE Act, but Republican leadership in particular, scared Democratic leadership into pulling consideration. And now they want to bring it to a vote later in November after the election. So we need that to happen. We need to get this vote on the floor. It's not going to pass the Senate this year. We know that. This is largely just getting it done. It will be reintroduced next session. It will be reintroduced next January. Hopefully January, maybe a little bit later than that. But it will be reintroduced. It will be reconsidered next year. So keep going on this. Keep talking to your senators. Keep talking to your representatives about this cannabis reform, because the MORE Act is something that will be highly consequential, making sure that we can really get the change that we need at every level of government if we get this done. So please reach out to your representatives and your senators. And then we need to make sure that the Harris rider is gone this year. COVID is kind of screwing things up. COVID's important, very important. So I'm not trying to take that away. But when we do ultimately pass a budget this year, like we have to every single year, we need to make sure that the Harris rider is not in that budget. So organizations like the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, or organizations like the Drug Policy Alliance, they're doing some great work on the Hill, making sure that the Harris rider does not get back into the budget. So sign up for their listservs, donate to them, reach out to them, see what you can do to help to make sure that the Harris rider is not included in the fiscal budget for this year. Then D.C. NORML is D.C. chapter of the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws. They left just a little note for everybody. It said, it's ridiculous that the political interests of certain congressional members supersedes the civil liberties of hundreds of thousands of D.C. residents who overwhelmingly voted in favor of legal marijuana for adults. D.C. NORML will continue to advocate for a fair and inclusive commercial marijuana market, while also supporting statehood efforts and other sensible reforms to end the disenfranchisement of our community and those who call the District of Columbia their home. If you want to learn more about D.C. NORML, their website's right there, dcnormal.org. And thank you so much. Here's our contact information. I put my co-founder, Kamani Jefferson's email on here as well. You can reach out to him too there. So yeah, if you guys want to reach out to us later after the event, please do. And our website's right there. Thanks so much.
Oh, there we go. Hello, everyone. So you just heard DC's State of State Cannabis Report. We are going to bring on Tyler for a couple of questions. If you have any questions, please drop them into the stage channel, and this time I will get to them, so I promise. We're going to bring Tyler on here in a second. Let's see. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Hi.
Hello.
Good to see you. Good to see you. It's been too long. So one thing I really wanted to touch a little bit on is just the home grow aspect of DC. I feel like it's very, very unique.
Yes. We have a lot of states, especially when they move to legalization, like Illinois, for instance. They were really trying to get a home grow aspect on there. However, the fight between, social justice advocates, freedom advocates, and the industry, it's a tug of war. And because DC doesn't have a market, it means that it's necessary for people to at least have the option to grow their own cannabis. DC, for some states too, like when we look at up and down the eastern seaboard, New Jersey is one. New Jersey's cannabis prices are exorbitant. They're ridiculous. And, which is why we have reciprocity here in the city, because it allows for people to come down and purchase cannabis at a much lower rate. So, when you have states with really high cannabis prices and you don't have something like home cultivation, that cuts out a lot of people who might be lower income but still need cannabis as a medicine. So DC, there's no discussion of removing home cultivation once we go fully legal. And I imagine that would be a deal breaker. We really, really should make sure that we mandate that for other states, because it's really important to have that access.
Can you emphasize again because it's been brought up in other sessions as well, just the impact of the election in November and what can that mean for DC?
Yeah. So I mean, we've had several cycles of full Democratic control, trifecta control, on the Hill. We got really close to statehood, I think in the mid 80s, I believe. but we just never really followed through on the Hill. So, the House, being the most progressive, folks ever elected to the House of Representatives, they finally took this up. And, through Eleanor Holmes Norton's long battle to get this done, they finally recognized her work on this. But the Senate, being Republican held, I mean, the consequences of having D.C. as a state would mean that we elect 2 Democratic senators and a Democratic House rep every year for forever. D.C. is over 90% Democrat. The people who are moving here are also far more liberal than they are conservative. So transplants like myself, people who choose to live here in the city instead of in Virginia, for instance, they're far more likely to be more progressive. So this city is never going to be a Republican city. It's never going to be purple. It's never going to be a flip state. So Republicans know this, and they're trying really hard to make sure that we don't get equal representation, because we will then make it harder for them. So if the Senate flips, we have a really high chance of becoming a state first, and hearing the MORE Act on the Senate floor. We have a high chance of, making sure that the Harris rider doesn't get put in the appropriations budget. So because Republicans and Democrats are using cannabis as, a tug of war issue, it's become something that's been put to the back burner, because there are things that are coming up that are more important, like COVID-19. I mean, it's a present issue, but cannabis is also something very important, because people are still getting arrested. We have these issues in prisons with COVID. So you have people with nonviolent drug charges that are sitting in prison, getting COVID and dying in prison. So it's still a very clear and present issue too. And the election has a very, very huge effect on what we do here in the city next year.
When I used to live in D.C., when I worked for the Washington Post, one of the big conversations, and I think you had mentioned this in your slides, were pop-ups, that they were popping up everywhere. One thing that I haven't asked yet to anybody is, really, with D.C. being a concentrated hub of media, how does media play a role in kind of the realities of the cannabis market right now?
Yeah, it's really interesting, because there is a good deal of people, like, it's not really sensationalized in a way that it is in other states. However, there was a CBD store that was raided in Georgetown. God, I can't remember. This year has gone by so fast and slow at the same time. So I don't remember if it was earlier this year or if it was late last year. But there was a CBD store raided because they, were apparently selling, cannabis, and, out the back. So the media kind of took that and ran with it. But it really, aside from those random types of instances, it really doesn't get a whole lot of play in terms of like local issues. Federal issues, things like Politico like to stoke the fire, especially with this MORE Act stuff. And I kind of
stoke the fire?
Yeah, they were just talking about, the MORE Act might not come out because of this, and people are scared of this and this and this. And I really feel like if they'd not been so sensationalist, we might have had a better chance of actually getting the MORE Act voted on last week than it ended up being. So
there is a pretty high influential power in media with politicians.
Yes. Yeah, the national scope is locally, the media doesn't care too much. It's not a huge thing, because it's been present for so long. But nationally, the national media on the Hill is definitely something that we've seen be both problematic and good. I mean, like, reporters like Natalie Fertig, she's fantastic.
Shout out to Mona as well. Hi, Mona.
And so, like, there's a whole lot of reporters that are doing really great work. But it gets to a point sometimes where the sensationalist factor sometimes tends to hurt more than help. Free media, though, media all the way, super important. Thank you, guys.
I'm not seeing any questions in the chat, so I will leave this last question with this: is 1 year from now, even if the pandemic is still here, where do you hope the conversation is?
I hope that our president next year, whomever they may be, decides to join the rest of the educated world and knowing that cannabis is not the devil, not the devil's lettuce, and that people who consume cannabis don't need to go to rehab. That people who want to participate in this market, whether it's as consumers or people who are in business with this, we're really lifting up the people who were most harmed, the communities that were most harmed, to make sure that they're reaping the benefits, whether that's through private industry or communities that have been over policed and criminalized, and making sure that we are putting forth front and center the people who should be, not the men's, none of them. We need to make sure that we're focusing on the people. So I'm hoping that, DC is allowed to be self-governing by that point. I'm hoping that the Senate flips so that we have a chance to do so. And we really put the people first.
Tyler McFadden, pleasure to have you. Really appreciate you spending some time to talk a little bit more about DC status, and hopefully those conversations do progress to that area next year.
Thank you, Tahid. I appreciate it. And Sharon, Curly Rose. Yep.
Sharon, hey. Oh, so everyone else too. The caucus rooms now for DMV, the DMV area caucus rooms are all open. DC state caucuses are there. So if y'all are from DC and you want to go check out the DC caucus room as well. Hang out and network and all that jazz. Thank you, Tyler. If you're able to stick around, check out the caucus as well. Mix and mingle. And thank you again for supporting the CannAtlantic Conference.
Thank you for having me. It's great.